Because an interesting development today is that the Reform UK membership is set to be higher than the Conservatives within a month. So certainly in membership terms, Reform are now more popular than the Conservatives. When it comes to voting intention, remember we had that poll, I think it was the week before last, putting them in second place behind the Conservatives. Why? Why are Reform now more popular than the Conservatives? Why are Reform getting to the point where they may well overtake the Conservatives both in membership and in polling? And what can the Conservatives do to win you back? 0344 499 1000. Is this terrible reading for Kemi Badenoch, or are you like Christmas magpies? After an election where there's been a landslide for a Labour government, are you looking over there seeing something shiny like Reform, but in actual fact, when it comes to the election itself, you'll go back to one of the two parties? And that actually our electoral system means that there isn't any point in loving Reform, because as much as you might love Reform, the odds are always stacked against them. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. Well, to talk about that, talk about the postal story, and to talk about the nightmare story about tax, the nightmare before Taxmas, well, we've got a lot to talk about. Let's now talk live to the former Labour MP. And Simon Danczuk, you are something to do with Reform now, aren't you?
I am indeed, yes. I'm a Reform member. That's right, Cristo. And Merry Christmas to you as well.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you in a bit of leisure wear as well. I always see you in a suit and tie.
Yeah, no, well, I'm calling from home, so I thought I'd dress down on Christmas Eve, if you've no objections.
Well, yeah, it might have been nice if you dressed up for me, but then you know what? It would have been a Christmas gift I couldn't have expected. No, Simon, nice to see you, as always. So, I mean, you are a Reform member. Now, you, of course, have jumped there from Labour, which, again, a lot of people have done that as well. A lot of what Reform are picking up are this cross-section, I would say, of people who are disillusioned with the Conservatives not being conservative enough, but also, I think, a lot of, for want of a better phrase, working-class people who are worried about the negative effects on their lives of immigration and how they perceive that to have been an issue. Do you think that's why Reform are more popular in their membership than the Conservatives? Or if not, why?
Yes, no, I do think it's to do with that. I think there's a revolution going on in British politics, and people can't underestimate that. There's no doubt about it. People like myself, and Lee Anderson will be another example, who's gone from being Labour, and then he transitioned through the Tory party to end up where he has with Reform. And I think you're right, illegal immigration is a big issue. I feel very strongly about that, but it's not the only issue. And you've talked about the recruitment figures for Reform. They've set a target of beating the membership within the Conservative Party, which is 131,000. And there's a counter on the Reform website that's showing you the new membership increase on a minute-by-minute basis. And since Monday, so yesterday, the beginning of yesterday, it was at around 120,000. When I checked it about 40, 50 minutes ago, it had reached 125,000. Now, the aim and the target is to get membership higher than the Conservatives by mid-January. But it's looking increasingly like it to me that it will reach over 131,000 by the end of December. So they'll actually be ahead of the game. You're exactly right. In the opinion polls, Reform is overtaking the Conservatives. And you've now got the three main parties. And can you believe that? This is a party that was only formed a few years ago. Three main parties are now Labour, Conservative and Reform. They're up there, all on about 20-odd percentage points in the opinion polls. And all of that is because people are fed up with Labour and Conservatives in government. That's the primary reason.
But Kemi Badenoch made a point yesterday when she was interviewed by Amal Rajan, saying that it's easy to be seduced by Reform. I'm paraphrasing what she was saying, but it's easy to be seduced by Reform because they throw out these sound bites and throw out policies that aren't particularly thought through, in her words, and she wants to be far more considered with what she comes up with. But of course, the big issue with that is that Reform are getting all the headlines and filling that policy vacuum that the Conservatives aren't filling at the moment. But I guess the question from that is it all just sound bites and bluster? And when it comes down to it, Reform don't actually have much else. They don't have firm, solid, thought-through policies.
The problem that Kemi Badenoch's got is that the Conservatives have lied to the electorate for the last decade or more. They said they would bring illegal immigration down, immigration down, and they've done exactly the opposite. Labour were no better when they were in power. And people feel very strongly about this. That's why they voted the way that they did in relation to Brexit. So the track record, and Kemi Badenoch has been in government, so she's responsible for some of these appalling results in terms of immigration. Reform has a very clear policy on this. First of all, turn the boats around, as they did in Australia. That is a policy that's quite doable. Use the Navy to turn these boats around.
It's not doable. It's not doable.
Well,
it's not doable. I'll tell you why it's not doable as things stand. And I'm not saying that Reform, I'm not trying to make a statement about whether Reform are right or wrong, but I've had this argument with Richard Tice, both on air and off air, so many times. But I think this comes down to an example of potentially where Reform have a good idea on paper, but in practicality the policy is unworkable. There has been more than one occasion in the last 2 or 3 years, Suella Braverman tried this, where the Navy were instructed to turn the boats round and the Navy refused. In fact, the Conservatives had to drop the policy. I think it was in February 22. They had to drop that policy because the Navy continually said that there would be a risk to life by having to turn the boats around, so therefore they would not do it. Now, when I've argued with Ben Habib about this, who is now no longer a part of Reform, but when he was, he said, well, we would force the Navy to do that, or we would fire the Navy that didn't do that. Well, again, how would you implement that? So if the most fundamental of the policy is that the Navy needs to do that, and the Navy would refuse to do that and have continually refused, isn't that an example of where Reform have a great policy on paper, but it is not remotely thought through?
Oh, well, I don't agree with you. I agree with Ben Habib and I agree with Richard Tice. And I think an hard conversation with the Navy about funding and about what needs to be done and what the priorities of this country are and what the public and the people of this country want from their Royal Navy is quite clear that the policy can be made to work. It's been made to work in other countries and it should be made to work here. But it's not the fundamental part of the policy anyway.
Can I just drill down on this and then I'll let you finish. But if the Navy say no, right, to a policy like that, then what is the next step? What could Reform do if the Navy continually refuses? They said that they won't use warships and they will not turn back, and they don't believe, the Royal Navy also say it's not their responsibility to turn back boats. That's not what they're there for.
Yeah, well, then the alternative to that would be to embolden the border force. And I'm absolutely confident that there are people who would come forward and fill those jobs where the border force is emboldened to turn those boats around. But that's the problem the Navy would be getting themselves in, isn't it? They'd end up being replaced. And that's a whole bigger issue for them to consider. But the other aspect of the policy is to come out to the European Convention on Human Rights. This has been used time and again through lawyers protecting illegal immigrants in this country, not allowing us to return them. And that's not acceptable. That's another aspect of Reform's policy in terms of illegal immigration. It's this sort of action that the people of this country want to see. And that's why people are flocking, quite understandably, to Reform. And it's the reason that Kemi Badenoch is having a disastrous first few months as leader of the party, and the same reason that Keir Starmer's had a nightmare this Christmas.
But also what Kemi Badenoch is saying is well, actually, I'm not going to do what Reform have done. And respectfully, you know, I don't think that Reform saying, well, look, we would fire the Navy or whatever else is in any way, shape or form practical when it comes to a policy of this nature. Now, I'm not knocking the concept of having to try and turn back the boats or coming up with a more stringent way of trying to stop illegal immigration. You know, that's not my job to comment on that, but it is my job to shine a light on what has been tried and what has failed, and I cannot see how turning back boats with a Navy that won't do it, or taking it to the next step, firing the Navy, replacing the Navy, that's a huge undertaking. And I just wonder whether it goes to show that whilst Reform have some great ideas, when you scratch the surface, underneath them, some of them aren't thought through. And that's the point Kemi Badenoch is making. That's why she says we're not coming up with policies yet, because we're not going to do what Reform are doing. They don't think them through. What would you say to that?
Well, Kemi Badenoch is just wrong. She's been in part of a government that has failed to tackle illegal immigration. Immigration under the Conservatives has gone through the roof, just as it did under Labour. Reform's policies do stand up. They've been used in other countries and they can be used in Great Britain. I've outlined that to you. Now, the public, you know, they've tried Labour, they've tried Conservatives. Now they are coming to the point where they are going to try Reform, and you can understand it, can't you? And, you know, you look at the membership figures. What we haven't discussed is that most Conservative members' membership renewal comes up in January. So they're at 131,000. I suspect when their renewal membership comes up, they will cancel, and more people are joining Reform. The numbers are going up all the time, and it's only £25 to become a member, and £10 if you're age 25 or less. I mean, it's a great last-minute Christmas present. I'm tempted to buy it for you, actually, Cristo. I haven't got you anything yet.
Well, that's very, very kind. I mean, it would be nice to receive something, Simon. I mean, you know, other than the mouldy old Satsuma and piece of coal you normally get me, which is not very nice. I think, by the way, I think you make a very, very fair point about immigration, and what is frustrating, and I think that the issue that Reform face. And look, so many of my friends are Reform. I think when I sort of try and pick holes in their policies, people think that I'm trying to knock Reform disproportionately. I'm not. Like, you know, I'm my goodness, I was at Richard Tice's party the other night. I'm friends with David Bull. I'm friends with all of these people who are a part of Reform. I think that the problem they have is, as I've alluded to, perhaps some of their policies need a bit more fleshing out. But the other thing I think is that, and it's a frustrating aspect of British politics that we have at the moment, is that anyone that tries to point out that perhaps immigration policy, not necessarily immigrants themselves, but immigration policy, some immigrants have bad intent, that's without a doubt, but it's immigration policy that I think most people have been frustrated with over the years. There is such a hysteria now, especially on social media, that you are far right or that you are in some way some sort of extremist, that I think that on that perhaps also Reform has something of an uphill battle, because you could have the most moderate Reform politician who would say, look, you know, we need to look at immigration policy, who'll make the points that you've made, that actually Labour failed and the Conservatives failed, and actually it's not just the illegal immigration, it's actually any kind of migration, and the statistics about how wages haven't gone up, and public services and infrastructure, and all of these very, very rational and balanced arguments, and people will still throw at you that you're an extremist and you're far right. And isn't that a real problem that Reform is facing?
Well, on your first point, we're having a robust debate, aren't we? And I welcome that, actually. I welcome the challenge. We're going to end up with better policies to serve Britain if we have a thorough discussion like what we're doing. So I appreciate the challenge. Ironically, just as an aside, it was only yesterday that I got blocked by Keir Starmer on Twitter, on X, for some bizarre reason. I've known him many years since he decided to block me, and for no reason. I haven't provoked him. I haven't been rude or offensive. He doesn't like being challenged. He doesn't like having the debate. He thinks he knows best, and look where that is getting us. But you're exactly right on the broader point that you made. Reform do have to challenge this view that we're an extremist party. I mean, we're clearly not. We're very moderate. That's the reality of it. But there is this perception amongst some people. But, you know, that's a problem with the left, actually. They often try and portray their opponents as being extreme or right-wing. They did it with Boris Johnson. The left in British politics tried to say Boris Johnson was a extreme right-winger. I mean, he's the most moderate left-wing conservative you're likely to meet, but they tried to paint him as such.
I think sometimes he was bordering on socialism, some of Boris Johnson's policy. I mean, they were ridiculous. It goes a race to net zero and the highest taxes under any Conservative government in history. I mean, that's not right.